Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking to Bob Hamilton, an FPRI Black Sea Fellow and Professor of Eurasian Studies at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Bob, it's good to have you on the show.
Thanks, Aaron. It's good to be here.
The things that we wanted to talk about today are events that are happening in Syria, which is a place that you know well. And the events have to do with the frequent interactions between Americans and Russians on the ground. So it brings together some of your areas of expertise, which is Russia, the military interaction, and events in Syria. So, I thought you were the perfect person to talk to because of your overlapping areas of expertise.
Well, thanks. And first, let me say that everything I'll say here reflects my own opinion and does not reflect the policy or position of the U.S. Army War College, the U.S. Army, or the Department of Defense. I was sent over in the summer of 2017 to stand up the Russian ground deconfliction cell for Syria. And ran it for several months in the summer and fall of 2017, which ended up being a fairly active time where the U.S. was fighting its way down the east bank of the Euphrates, fighting ISIS, and the Russians and the Syrian regime were fighting their way across the central desert of Syria toward the Euphrates River. And so the Euphrates at the time was a de facto deconfliction line between the U.S. and Russia. But, there were several incidents in the fall, especially in 2017, that brought our forces into fairly close contact with each other.
I think I wanted to start at the beginning, and a lot of people don't really understand that term deconfliction or what deconfliction really entails. It sometimes I see people think that it's like this ability to perfectly coordinate on the ground, but I wouldn't say that perfectly captures what it was. So maybe you could explain it to us.
No, that's right, Aaron. In fact, coordination and cooperation are expressly not what we do with the Russian armed forces in Syria, and that's actually in law, starting in, I believe, 2016, but I'd have to check that. But in successive National Defense Authorization Acts, Congress has written into the law that the U.S. military is prohibited from any sort of coordination or cooperation with the Russian armed forces. So in Syria, what that means is all we can do is deconfliction, and that means all we can do is the type of interaction and the type of communication with the Russians that prevent us from inadvertently escalating the situation by coming into contact with them on the ground.
Yeah, and I think that the necessity of even putting in place, mechanisms to at least let each other know where we are, is the way I always think about it, is exactly what you're talking about at the top of this, is that it was becoming quite acute in that Russians and Americans were quite often stumbling or coming across each other in close proximity.
Yeah, that's right. So, and many of your listeners will probably know, if they're following Syria, that we've had an air deconfliction effort in place with the Russians for a couple of years before we had the ground deconfliction effort in place. The air deconfliction effort actually dates to late 2015, after the Russians intervened. There was an air deconfliction cell set up at our Combined Air Operations Center in Al Udeid, Qatar, and the Russians had one at their air base in Maymim, Syria, and that was to keep air operations from inadvertently stumbling on each other in the air or creating unsafe conditions in the air. So, but as you said, in the spring and summer of 2015, as Russian and U.S. forces fought ISIS initially in different parts of the country, but they started to come into closer contact with each other, especially in the summer of 2017, around the northern Euphrates River, places like Tapka and Raqqa, where the U.S. and its partner force, the Syrian Democratic Forces, were fighting ISIS, and also at the U.S. garrison Al Tanf, which is along the Iraq-Jordan-Syria tri-border area. There were several incursions into that security zone around our garrison at Al Tanf that caused the U.S. to decide, at least on our side, that we needed to have a ground deconfliction channel with the Russian headquarters at Maymim in Syria. And so the call went out from the headquarters in Kuwait and Iraq, the U.S. headquarters, And a deconfliction cell was stood up in the summer of 2017. I was over there to lead it with 4 interpreters, Russian English interpreters.
So, and I think one of the interesting things here is that around that time, and I'm bringing this up because, things did change in October 2019, is that even though the two, like particularly the Russians, weren't ready to accept the Euphrates River as a deconfliction line, it was a natural barrier to sort of a large or a pronounced Russian or regime presence moving across it. Now, I know that they tried, and if you want to talk about that, you can, but it sort of created like de facto physical rules of the road around which we could negotiate. Would you say that's a fair and accurate summation of how that worked?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, the river acted on the ground as a very effective deconfliction line, right? Because it's a physical barrier. And to come across it, first of all, requires equipment and effort. And also, once you're across, the other side will know because of the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets that we both had in the air. So we had been across in the northern Euphrates River Valley, places, like I said earlier, Raqqa and Topka. So there was, as part of that operation to liberate Raqqa from ISIS, the U.S. had come across the river, and the Russians sort of agreed to that in a deconfliction agreement. We were also on the west side of the river, as I mentioned earlier, the garrison of Al Tanf, which is important for a lot of reasons. But one of the main things it does is it protects a camp for internally displaced persons along the Jordanian border with Syria, and it also sits astride the Iraq-Jordan-Syria border and helps prevent the infiltration of Iranian-backed militias into Syria. So those were 2 places where the U.S. was on the west side of the river. In September of 2017, as part of their operation to liberate Deir ez-Zor from ISIS, Deir ez-Zor sits on the west side of the river, but the Russians and the Syrian regime had come across the river just south of Deir ez-Zor, and they were in a small box, only a kilometer or 2 wide from the river and about 4 or 5 kilometers deep. And the deconfliction agreement that we updated with them and agreed to with them in mid-September of 2017 allowed them to stay in that box on the east side of the river as long as they didn't come out of that box.
There were some flare-ups. There were some incidents in the air as well, but for the most part, it was professional interaction. And I would say basically since October 2019, and why I circle that date is because that's the date that President Trump sort of hastily announced the withdrawal of U.S. forces as Turkish forces were crossing the border in an invasion. And in that sort of melee, the Russians were able to come across, and they have, along with the regime, established themselves along the Turkish-Syrian border. And now you have Russian patrols, outside of the original framework for that deconfliction. And that's where you're seeing the frictions now. Would you say that's an accurate summary?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Right. So our withdrawal from the Turkish border on the east side of the Euphrates, which, like you said, started in late 2019. The Turkish armed forces then came across, launched an operation against the Syrian Democratic Forces, the U.S. partner force, which they claim that the Kurdish part of that of the Syrian Democratic Forces is allied with what Turkey considers terrorist groups in Turkey. The SDF, though, is about half Sunni Arab and half Kurdish. But anyways, Turkey came across. The Russians were also able to move across the river on the east side of the Euphrates, sort of into the vacuum that the U.S. created when it withdrew from the Turkish border. And so what we're seeing now is Russian patrols and Turkish armed forces operations in northeastern Syria, in an area where before our withdrawal, the U.S. and the SDF were really the only forces operating once ISIS had been defeated there.
So this is something I don't really know the answer to, and it's something that I am curious about. Well, before I ask you that, your main area of expertise lies both in the basically the former Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, and the newly independent states, although they're not so new anymore. And one of the things that Russian tactics along sort of these roads in Syria reminds me of is sort of what the Soviets used to do to the Western, and I forgot what they call them, and maybe you'll be able to remind me, is that those Western teams that used to be able to drive into East Germany to watch military exercises, and they would run them off the roads, and they would frequently bump them, and I don't know if you're, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but am I totally off in thinking that we've kind of gone back to like this very like dangerous, but albeit controlled, like danger in terms of Russians and Americans bumping up against each other in contested spaces?
No, you're not wrong at all, and that's actually, you're going to make this a longer podcast than we thought it was going to be, Aaron, because actually the organization that you mentioned, my father was a part of from
Oh, really?
1978. Yeah, the USMLM is what it
That's
calls
it. Yes.
Yeah, U.S. Military Liaison Mission in West Berlin, and the French and the British had similar missions based out of West Berlin, and the Soviets had one in Frankfurt.
Right.
And it was a confidence building measure, and it was by agreement we were allowed to patrol overtly in marked vehicles in East Germany in the DDR, and the Soviets were allowed to patrol in West Germany and keep track of troop movements just to make sure that there was not a mobilization going on. Right. So. And my father was actually involved in an incident in early 1979 where an East German truck rammed. They were in a Dodge Ram Charger, and they would always go out with one military officer, a Russian speaker, and then a non-commissioned officer as the driver, who was always a German speaker or tended to be. And they were driving past an East German air defense site, and the East Germans knew they were coming. Had a truck back up on a side road, and as they came by, they put down the gate, the Schlagbaum thing, to try to stop them, and they evaded that, and then they brought a truck out and rammed them on the left side of this Ram Charger. It rolled into a field 2 or 3 times. My dad was taken to an East German hospital. The driver was released eventually into U.S. military custody, and then eventually my dad was allowed. The Soviets and East Germans allowed the U.S. military liaison mission folks to come get him and then take him back into West Berlin. But so that's a little story to illustrate how that happened during the Cold War. And of course, it got worse. There was a U.S. Army major named Nicholson who was shot and killed by a Soviet sentry in East Germany as part of that same mission a few years later. So anyway, you're exactly right. It is the sort of behavior that went on during the Cold War. And it's the sort of behavior we're seeing, similar behavior in Syria. This most recent incident with the Russian vehicle ramming the U.S. vehicle and 4 U.S. soldiers having concussions appears to be a case where the Russians claim to have deconflicted their movement into this area. The U.S. claims that they were unaware, there was no deconfliction done. In any case, these 2 patrols found themselves in the same area, and the Russian vehicles. Russian patrol appears to have been larger from looking at the video, and also had attack helicopters in support of it and everything. And it rammed the U.S. vehicle, and the U.S. then sort of withdrew to de-escalate the situation. But yeah, I think your analogy is good. It's the same type of behavior we saw during the Cold War. This sort of aggressive, escalatory behavior, really sometimes just to gauge what the response of the other side will be.
It was the MLM teams, and it's just when I saw the video. So I think for listeners, what happened is that I don't even remember exactly where it was, but these two patrols came across each other, and the Russians rammed the American patrol, and American service people were injured with concussions or concussion-like symptoms, which concussion-like symptoms, which suggests that they weren't wearing their harnesses in the back seat, or they were just thrown against the inside of their vehicles. Either one. 2, and I think the most alarming part, but also the part that we don't know a lot about, is that there was video. The Russians always like to release video when they look good. Is that they had, and I'm very bad at IDing Russian military equipment. A helicopter's like doing very low sort of hover over the top of the U.S., which is a big no-no, right? You do not have foreign adversaries overfly U.S. troops on the ground. Now, we do not know what was above those Russian helicopters. Could be nothing, could have been something. but it's always something that stuck out in my mind. But it did remind me of as you said, and I promise listeners I did not know your father was part of the MLM teams. But it reminded me of that. But the question I have for you about that, given your experience with deconfliction, is how is deconfliction even supposed to work? Absent like maybe more robust protocols than maybe I'm aware of, given the changes on the ground. I understood it with geography, I guess pre-October 2019, but post-October 2019, ground deconfliction seems to be much harder to execute and less barriers to the Russians testing the American response, which is what I think we're seeing.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So the people who were sitting in the seat that I was sitting in the summer and fall of 2017 have I would say, a more difficult and dynamic environment right now than we did in the early days of this effort because, again, the river no longer acts as a deconfliction line. The Russians are on the east side of the river and they roam fairly freely. And they often will say, as they said this time, they said they deconflicted their movement. The way it's supposed to work is if they want to move in an area that's outside of their sort of agreed upon zone, or we want to do the same, or if they want to strike with either aircraft or artillery, an area that's outside of their agreed upon zone because they see ISIS there or they see an enemy force there, they're supposed to call us up or else email us and give us the exact location that they want to move in or strike, what they're moving against or striking against, and when the movement or strike will occur. Then we either deconflict or we don't. If we don't have forces in the area, then we will say, okay, we deconflict, and they're free to strike there or move there. If we have forces or partner forces in the area, we'll say we do not deconflict, and they'll do the same to us if we ask to move in or strike in an area that is outside of our normal zone of operations. So if we don't deconflict, then they're not supposed to do the movement or do the strike. But what they will often do is call us up, say, we're going to strike here. We see ISIS. We'll say, no, that's not ISIS. That's U.S. forces or U.S. partner forces. And then they'll strike there anyways, or they'll strike close to there in order sort of to escalate the situation to see what the response is. They often, when I was there at least, they were always very, very careful if they knew U.S. forces were in an area not to strike right on that area. They would try to strike out in front of it or to the sides of it, which is a dangerous game too, right? It's almost like the airstrike or artillery version of the vehicle ramming, sort of thing that you were describing earlier. If you make a mistake and you kill U.S. forces, then you have an escalation. You have a serious escalation, and so. This is actually something they've been doing as long as we've been in Syria, as long as the U.S. and Russia have both been in Syria. I think mostly it's to gauge response, or when I was there in the fall of 2017, it was mostly about trying to prevent the Syrian Democratic Forces and their U.S. Advisors from moving down the east bank of the Euphrates and clearing ISIS out of that zone because the Russians and the Syrian regime didn't want us there. Essentially, they wanted to be in the eastern desert of Syria. Assad has promised to take back every inch of the country, and so they did not want to have to deal with us in that part of Syria, and so they would try to deter us by striking in front of where we were moving.
Which caused issues for the air deconfliction. It's an interesting because I know a good amount about the air deconfliction too, and it put our guys up above in a really weird spot because the Russians would, to use fighter pilot language, which sometimes I mangle and screw up, but point the nose at U.S. ground forces, and that could be interpreted as a hostile act because they have weapons that can then be used, and then often they would use them in close proximity, even though we were essentially deconflicted. So it was a very dangerous game that they played, and I've always thought about it like this, is that they usually wanted something when they would escalate. There was an escalation with purpose. And as you just said, the 2017 incidents, and there were many, I think that they wanted a buffer on the other side of the river that they could then occupy. They have that buffer now in certain respects because of October 2019. So now I'm left wondering, that was a pretty brazen thing that we saw. What is it that they want? Do they want us to leave Syria, or do they want some more robust ground deconfliction? And they will say something like coordination to strike ISIS, which is very difficult for us because of the legal stuff that you were talking about, included in the NDAs. If you had to put on your hat, and prediction is folly, but if you had to think what they wanted from us now, given the current situation on the ground, I mean, what are your guesses?
What they want is they want us out of Syria, because the only way they can end the war or claim to have ended the war and restored the sovereignty of the Assad regime is if the U.S. is no longer an actor on the ground. So we're still at Al-Tanf, so we've still got a garrison there, and they really don't have an answer for how to get rid of that. And then despite the fact that we've withdrawn from the Turkish-Syrian border in northeastern Syria, we're still in northeastern Syria. We're still partnering with the SDF. And so they want us out, and so I think if this incident that happened a week or so ago was directed from the top, it's aimed at escalating the situation and seeing if they can cause us to eventually, through a series of these types of escalations, just to conclude that it's not worth being in Syria and find some way to leave, right? And I mean, so the evidence. October 2019 would argue that the evidence is on their side, right? The U.S. can be driven out of Syria with some strongly worded calls from, that's apparently the Erdogan call with President Trump was what precipitated our withdrawal from the border. So I think that's what they want. That's their end game, is get the U.S. out of Syria. There's always the possibility as well that this was just, we talk all the time when I was in the military about the strategic corporal, right? Some guy who does something on the ground that has strategic effects. Mm-hmm. And so it's always possible that this was not directed by the Russian headquarters. This was literally just a leader of a patrol deciding to be a little more aggressive than maybe his leadership even wanted him to be. So it's really hard to say. But if there is an end game to it, it's part of an effort to get us to leave Syria altogether so that they can declare the war over and go about, restoring the sovereignty of the Assad regime.
I think it's that. It could be some random person on the ground. And I think that may even be the most plausible, is that you get a guy who's got up on the wrong side of the bed and maybe gets scared, has a little bit of anxiety, running into a bunch of Americans he didn't plan for, or maybe he's just not a nice person. Or two, one of the things that I also am thinking about is, do they want to force deeper deconfliction? And I am intentionally not using coordination, but do they want to do like to use, deconfliction plus? So, a more robust mechanism to try and share information about where we move, and perhaps try and coordinate. And I know that word is not the right word, but I can't think of a better one. How we drive around on these patrols, like something like they have with the Turks, which is like these integrated joint patrols, which I know will never happen, but is that some way that they could force that sovereignty, that sovereignty issue without necessarily having to kick U.S. forces out? And that's the only other variable that I'm also considering, because I'm not sure that it's kick America out immediately, although I think that they would like that. It's maybe, we can keep the Americans around so long as they do what we ask them.
Yeah, I mean, they've always been interested, so going back to my first experience with dealing with the Russians in Syria was in Geneva as part of the U.S. delegation to the UN Syria Support Group in summer of 2016. And at that point, as you well know, because I know you're writing a book about it, there was this idea of a joint U.S.-Russian targeting cell that would be set up in Geneva. And so they were very, very interested in more cooperation, coordination, joint planning, and everything with the United States then. That all really fell apart in the fall of 2017 due to the Russian and Syrian attack on eastern Aleppo, which was sort of one of the opposition capitals at the time. But yeah, so they always, for a long time, they've been interested in more, in closer cooperation or coordination. We used to call it, when I was in the Russia deconfliction cell, we call it advanced deconfliction, right? Because we can't cooperate or coordinate, but there are certain things you have to do. You have to notify your movement to a certain area so that you don't catch them by surprise, and they would do the same. I think they are interested, as long as they can't get us out, they're interested in consigning us to a role that they can sort of agree with and stomach. They used to send us maps all the time when I was in the deconfliction cell, showing their plan for how the territory of eastern Syria would be divided up, and it essentially had the U.S. and the SDF pushed up into this tiny little corner of northeastern Syria, and the Russians and the regime and the whole rest of the eastern part of the country, which they at the time, and still don't, they didn't have the capacity to do that at the time, because that was mostly ISIS territory at the time, and the only people, they were busy fighting ISIS in Deir ez-Zor in the eastern desert, and they really needed the U.S. and the SDF to do that fighting ISIS work for them east of the river, but they didn't want us to do it. They wanted us to stay up in the northern part of the country, the little corner in the northeast, and let them handle the rest.
Well, now in a recent piece for FPRI, I suggest, after the ramming, I suggested something along the lines of, if we really are serious about sticking around there, a way to let out the pressure valve, would be to explore again something along the lines that you were talking about that was discussed at Geneva, which is, depending on the joint, the
JIG, yeah,
joint what was it called, the joint blah 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 group, the joint
intelligence group, or
joint intelligence group,
yeah,
or the joint intelligence cell, depending on which side of the U.S. government. There was two different acronyms for it. Yeah, which probably won me no popularity points on Twitter or anywhere else. But now I'm thinking that maybe we need to just do these confidence building measures like we used to do in East Germany, out of Berlin and Frankfurt, two of my favorite cities. But yeah, after this podcast.
No, I think you're right. I mean, we need to be talking to the Russians, as frustrating as it can be at times. We're both still in the air and on the ground in Syria. We need to avoid future events like we had with the ramming incident. And again, we may never know whether that was intentional, directed from their headquarters in Hammeim, or whether it was just the guy on the ground, like you said, had a bad day or got scared and overreacted. But nevertheless, just like the incidents in the air, and just like the incidents in East Germany during the Cold War, everyone has the potential to escalate way beyond the level to which either side wants it to. So preventing them or eliminating them is definitely in both of our interests.
Bob, this has been fascinating. Thanks for taking the time. Is there any last words you want to say?
No, I would just say, aside from, they're all over northeastern Syria, we should be watching that little box that they're still in south of Deir ez-Zor on the east side of the river, because there was some indications about a week ago that there was fire coming out of that box toward a U.S. base east of that, which is, of course, you remember, Aaron, that box in February 2018 is where they came out of, the Wagner Group and the Syrian government allied forces came out of and attacked toward the U.S. and SDF, which caused the U.S. response that killed somewhere in the 200 range of the attackers. So that little box east of the Euphrates and south of Deir ez-Zor bears some watching too.
I just want to bring up the Wagner thing. I think one of the things that differentiates the Wagner thing from the ramming is that when we called them to talk about what was happening out of that box, they told us they weren't Russians. Now, if they would have told us they were Russians, I'm not sure that the response would have been exactly the same. And I'm not sure how you think about that. So I'm not sure that that's the best example to think about how the U.S. will respond.
Yeah, and that thing, I talked to my successor, my successor's successor, I think, who was sitting in the seat when that happened. And he said, yeah, we called him. When we saw that movement out of the box, and the Russian headquarters at Hammeim essentially said, not our guys. And so they were aware the U.S. was going to strike them. So I'm not sure, I've talked to a lot of people who know more about how the Russian military operates than I do. And a lot of them think it was sort of a freelance operation on the part of the Wagner Group and government allied militias. That the Russian headquarters may have been aware of, but did not underwrite or back in any way. So you're right, much different situation than marked Russian vehicles with uniformed Russian soldiers, which is what we're dealing with now in northeastern Syria.
All right. And with that, I will wrap up. So, Bob, thank you for coming on. I appreciate you sharing some knowledge. And if listeners, if you hear a little background noise at the end, it's because we're in a pandemic and my son is here and he decided to walk in on my podcast studio. So, with that, Bob, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure, Aaron. Thanks a lot.
And thanks, everybody, for listening.